All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Charles. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a member of Democratic Socialists of America, specifically the New York City chapter, and a member of the AfroSocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus. A bit about DSA and AfroSoc. So DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, it's the largest socialist organization in the United States. DSA members are building progressive movements for social change while establishing an openly democratic socialist presence in American communities and politics. The AfroSocialists and Socialists of Color Caucus is, as I just said, the Socialists of Color Caucus. It's DSA's Black and Persons of Color Caucus. We're members of those communities. Work to build a multiracial working class base, which we believe is the only viable strategy for securing a socialist future. So you're here for the fire this time. It's Juneteenth today. Happy Juneteenth. Juneteenth is Emancipation Day. It's when folks in Texas finally found out they were liberated, quite a bit later than the rest of the country knew. So we celebrate it as Emancipation Day. And for Black people in the United States, I would say that it's been the struggle for Black liberation that I think has pushed this country forward to try and make it the democracy that it sometimes succeeds, but often fails in claiming to be. So today, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be hearing some report backs from some comrades involved in the protests happening around the country right now. Then we're going to hear a little bit of history about the role of racism in the United States public health system. We're going to talk about COVID and the impact it's had on Black communities and communities of color. And fighting back within the context of COVID, as well as these uprisings that have been happening in response to police violence. And then we'll have some discussion. So the first of our speakers offering a report back is Jessica Garraway from Twin Cities DSA. You're muted, Jessica. Here.
My doing. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, I'll get started. As was said, my name is Jessica Garraway. I've done some work with the local DSA here in the Twin Cities, mostly around the eco-socialist branch. So I guess a report back. So the day after George Floyd was murdered by the police, he was murdered right outside a store called Cup Foods on Lake Street, Chicago Lake. And the next day, there were thousands and thousands of people that flooded the streets in protest. I was surprised to see so many people there. I want to note everyone did a pretty good job of wearing their masks when they were out there. And it started with some speeches outside of where he was killed. And then we went on a very long march to the precinct responsible for his death. And what we saw there was a level of militancy that hasn't been present in the city for a very long time. I want to go rewind a bit back in 2015. Jamar Clark was murdered by the police here in Minneapolis, and there was a mini uprising right outside the precinct that was just down the street where he was murdered by the police. And okay. Let's see. Okay, so it's not just you.
It seems like your connection
maybe
maybe. Sorry. Maybe try and turn off your video and continuing. All right, so because of technical difficulties, we're going to move ahead in the agenda and then we can come back to Jessica. Next up is Juliana. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but I'm going to try. Goes. I don't know if that's right. Please tell me if I got it wrong. From Brazil.
You got it right. Thank you. Hello, Justin. Hello. First, I just want quickly to thank Robert Coffey for the invitation, for being here. So I am Afro-Brazilian, but I'm currently living in Massachusetts. And I just wanted to give a short report about how the struggles are going on in Brazil and how they're very strongly connected to what's happening in the US. So first I want to give a context of how we Afro-Brazilians heard about George Floyd's murder, what was happening at that time. A few days before George Floyd being murdered, João Pedro, a 14-year-old kid in Brazil, he was murdered by the police inside of his house. He lived in a favela, for those who doesn't know the term, the Chantintal in Rio de Janeiro. And the police got in his house when he was hiding from a shooting with his cousins that are all them teenagers and child. They shot on him and they took his body, put it in a helicopter and disappeared with his body. His family spent 17 hours looking for João Pedro's until finally find the body at the EML, that is the Medical Legal Institute in Brazil. So when we heard about was happening in the US, we were actually in the middle of protests because of that, in which more than 800 organizations in Brazil had signed petitions and also the declarations against the genocide of Black people in Brazil. And why I say genocide, Brazil is the second largest Black population in the world. For people who doesn't know, like we are the largest Black population in the Americas, and each 23 minutes, one Black person is murdered. These reports are actually very underestimated because this data only contains the information about Black young men. Women and old people are all out of the statistics, so the number would increase the number of murders if you count all the Black population. So when we're in this context, in which we're protesting for João Pedro's murder, and then you heard of the atrocities that were happening here in the US. In a context also in which, as in the US, we're fighting against COVID-19, Right now, Brazil is the second larger, right after the United States, in terms of number of cases. There are many studies that suggest that we're going to be the next epicenter of the epidemic, but we are really not having reliable data on how many infections we have because the government is refusing to test people and to promote and to establish quarantines and other dynamics that can generate economic crisis. That is the course of the current president. And we're also fighting against the possibility of a military coup. So who doesn't know, Brazil lived the last 30 years in a kind of democracy, and I'm going to explain why I'm saying kind, and prior to that, we lived 30 years of military dictatorship. And the militaries are right now in the power again. They reach out through the elections, but now there's a possibility of another military intervention. So what are we doing? Like in this context, what can we do and what can we do for fighting for our lives, but also to support the brothers and sisters from the United States? So yesterday, actually, was launched a video, but this week we're launching that campaign called "As Long as there is Racism, There is No Democracy." This campaign is promoted by the Black Coalition for Rights. That is, I see somebody here, Fora Bolsonaro. I agree, Fora Bolsonaro. The Black Coalition for Rights is an alliance between more than 100 organizations, Black Brazilian organizations. And it was created a couple of years ago when the current president assumed the power with a very new fascist agenda. Some people call him the Trump from the Tropicals, which I hardly agree with that definition, because although he has many similarities with Trump, the difference that he has the army support of militaries. So we launched this campaign, this national campaign, to try to first rethink what it is. Does our context of democracy is really threatened just because of the militaries, or because even though when the militaries are not in the power, we have a systematic murder of Black people, right? So one of the things that are often saying is that in the whole history of Brazil, white people had democracy, but Black people always lived under authoritarian states. And also it's a way to rethink what really means democracy. So if you have, the United States is widely known in the world as one of the great democracies, but let's put in the sense of one of the most consolidated democracies, but which it's really a democracy when you have the number of the largest number of incarcerated people in the world, or the police violence, the systematic police violence that also happens against African Americans and other marginalized communities in the US. So this campaign that was launched this week, it's part of this campaign that we have both protests on the streets, but also a lot of virtual actions, considering the situation of the COVID, right? The Black population in Brazil has been hardly affected by the COVID-19, so there is also a care. Most of the grassroots organizations are a little bit focused on trying to, okay, so I'm gonna just conclude. So are trying to focus on also provide medicines, cleaning products, and food for their families. So they are trying to put this together with protests and with online actions to mobilize this campaign. And also, particularly the women in Brazil are creating, we call Levante das Mulheres. That would be something like Women Stand Up. And it's against Bolsonaro, against the president. So last month, many social movements made alliance in Brazil to request the impeachment of the president, but not only his removal, but the removal of his old office. That includes all the militaries that are behind him. And so the connection between these, the women's movements and the Black movements in Brazil that is going on right now, is an attempt to give an answer to the fascists and to the anti-Blackness that is happening, both in Brazil, but also in solidarity with the US. George Floyd's name is definitely, we have on the flyers and it's one of the names that people are strongly mentioning on our protests. The statement of the campaign, it's also talking about that. So I think I don't know if I have more time. Just think, or if I should just let the other comrades go.
Yeah, we'll move on with the agenda, but hopefully, if people have any questions or comments for you, Juliana, they can do so when we get to discussion after everybody's spoken. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like we have Jessica Garraway back, so I'm gonna hand it over to Jessica now.
Hi, sorry about that. Computer's a little on the fritz. So I'm going to start over from what I was saying before. So when after George Floyd was murdered, either the next day or that coming weekend, there were thousands of people who came out into the streets. I was surprised by how many people I saw. It was thousands upon thousands. People were giving speeches right outside Cup Foods on Chicago, where he was murdered. And after that, people walked a couple miles to the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct that was responsible for George Floyd's death. And what we saw there was a level of militancy that we haven't seen in the Twin Cities for a very long time. I would say probably we haven't seen that level of militancy since the Teamsters strikes here in the 1930s. So I'm going to go backwards a bit. 2015, Jamar Clark was murdered by the police here in Minneapolis, on the north side of Minneapolis, which is where I live now. And what happened for about 3 weeks where people occupied that precinct to take a stand against what happened. Now there was a mini uprising that happened for 2 to 3 of the nights that people were there. People threw Molotovs, people threw bricks, but that was contained and also stifled by the professional protest class here. A lot of the BLM crowd really kind of put a damper on that militancy and took steps to blame it on outside agitators, anarchists, what have you. Now, I go back to show a contrast between the two moments. Once we had marched to the police precinct over George Floyd's murder, the professional protest class could not stifle the militancy of the people. People really had enough. People have done the peaceful demonstrations and doing everything the right way, and people threw down. You saw I would say it was definitely a broad working class uprising, though obviously Black and brown youth were the ones who really led it. So people, a lot of the police cars and personal cars of the police were destroyed. I'm sure a lot of you know what happened to the high-rise apartments. A gentrifying project was burnt down. A lot of the corporate businesses were like Target were broken into. People took the things that they needed. Also, we most notably is that the 3rd precinct was actually burnt down. And I think it's clear to a lot of us that without that level of militancy, conversations surrounding police abolition would not be on the table. In the Twin Cities, we have 9 out of 13 city commissioners. I'll get to that. City commissioners who stated that they will work to abolish the police. Now, these are elected officials, and we're still within capitalism, so I'm suspect of what of what they're actually thinking about doing. But the fact that this is now put on the agenda is a tremendous victory for the movement, I think. Yeah, I'll get back to one point, the stifling of militancy. You know, since I've been in this town, I moved here in 2015, right around when John Mark Clark was murdered. There has been a class of people, usually college educated, Black folks within the, either in the Black Lives Matter organization or movement. I consider myself part of the broader movement as well. But anyway, that have used the platform they have to stifle militancy. They've used the platform they've had to, to do that. And this was something very different in that they didn't have control when it came to this uprising. A lot of them were not there. They came more. What seems to happen is an uprising happens, people get upset, and then they come in and they, utilize the situation to push things that are really important, like obviously police abolition, but the acknowledgement of towards the militants of how we got to this point is never fully addressed. Now, I will say this time, a lot of that same crowd, the BLM crowd, they didn't blame white anarchists. They didn't decry the movement or the militancy. They just didn't talk about it, which is definitely a step up from trying to stifle it, but and blaming other people for it. But it's still not good enough. And we really need to understand the role that militancy plays in these struggles. I mean, a lot of the concessions we got, say, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, were because of militancy, along with other tactics like nonviolent civil disobedience. And we, our movements are weakened by not understanding this history. One last thing. I just kind of jumped right into everything. My name, Jessica Garraway. A lot of my work is very focused on the intersection between racial justice and environmental justice. I'm saying that, well, first of all, BLM, Black Lives Matter, is a very broad movement. So I do think there are mistakes made when people want to paint with broad brushes about making claims about the movement either way. I really want to focus on BLM as a movement, how it's manifested here in the Twin Cities. And a lot of those folks, I really like them. I respect them a lot. They do work that I think is good work, but just from what I've observed, they are not, at least publicly, in support of militancy. And I did observe at times during past struggles, and we saw that that we've seen in past struggles, using anarchist as a cop out, distancing themselves from that. I will say that some of those people who were Black Lives Matter, by the way, is in Oregon. Our city isn't really that active anymore. People have moved on to other projects, but that sort of same milieu has definitely gotten better in that they're not publicly denouncing it, at least from what I observed. But then another point I want to touch on, we had the governor here. He talked about, they said it was outside agitators. They said it was white supremacists. They said it was the cartels that were responsible for the majority of the uprising that took place. And I'm not denying that there were that there probably were some white supremacist elements out there, but to say that they were responsible for the majority of what took place, I know the cartels, it's crazy. Yeah, saying that they're responsible for the majority of the uprising that took place is simply not true. That's not what I observed when I was in the streets and we were getting tear gassed. But yeah, that's I'll wrap it up so we can move on to other folks. If there's any questions, I'm open to that as well. Lastly, I do want to say this really quick. I was also involved in work with a hotel called the Sheridan that got taken over by homeless folks and activists during the uprising. Over 200 people were living in that hotel, people who did not have housing for the longest time. And the city could not see the city did nothing to really address the problem except push homeless folks away from camp after camp. So people were staying there for about 2 weeks. A lot of the organizers felt that the space was not safe anymore. And so the decision was made for a lot of people to leave and to reoccupy a park called Powderhorn Park. The park board has said that they do not want to evict people from the park until there's an actual place for people to go. So that is definitely a victory in itself, that people were that the move has been made to not evict people, and that people in the community has been protective of that project.
All right, thanks so much, Jessica. If you have any more questions for Jessica, hang on to them. You can either ask them in the Q&A and we'll come to them later, or you can ask when we get to the Q&A after everybody's spoken. So now I'm going to move on and head it over to Robert Cuffey to give us a little bit of historical context on racism in the US public health system. Robert, you're up.
And I had trouble unmuting myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone else for being on this panel. Of course, this is a very important discussion. And we're living in a moment unprecedented in US history, where there's not just a Black uprising against police brutality, all of the of young people and the union movement taking steps it has never taken before, some symbolic, some of great significance, like the shutdowns of the ports today for Juneteenth. So to understand this moment, I just want to step back and give some historical information. And I'm kind of doing this on the fly, so our other speaker, Edna Bonham, could not make it, and she has more expertise in public health. So I'm just going to speak more broadly to the question of Black liberation that Justin brought up in the beginning, and its relationship to the history of the United States generally, and specifically the functioning of capitalism in the United States. If it can be said that the Caribbean was a laboratory for testing and inventing anti-Black racism, then I guess it is very accurate to say that in the United States, this is where the human trials really went in full gear. It's where people experimented on Black folk with medical technology. And as a result, there's a lasting legacy in the United States where Black people are phobic of medical care, and where medical care perceives Black people and Black bodies with a certain amount of invincibility. And that myth of invincibility was built up as a justification for Black slavery. So in circumstances like the testing on the Tuskegee Airmen for syphilis, or even going far abroad of testing birth control and taking away the ability for women to have children in Puerto Rico, there's a material basis for which people are distrustful of the medical field. I think one thing of significance we need to point to is that in the autopsy for George Floyd, it was found that he had the antibodies for COVID-19 in his system. The COVID-19 that's decimated the Black population in the United States and globally at vastly disproportionate rates. And we have to ask ourselves, What is the value of a society where someone who is described in all aspects as a loving father, as a community person, as someone everyone just referred to as Floyd and a gentle giant, that he survives this public health crisis only to be killed by a racist police system? And to fully understand that context, we have to go back to the fact that after emancipation, and today is Juneteenth, and Juneteenth speaks so much of the contradictions. Is after emancipation, that's me pretending I'm not on the street. After emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation was declared. It took 2 years for the people of Texas to actualize their freedom. But much more than this, after the Civil War was won and the South was defeated, when we saw this great period of gains for Black Americans, when we saw the election of the first Black Congress people, for example, pretty soon after, in the Compromise of 1851, we saw those gains reversed under President Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson has a distinct legacy that is very Trumpian insofar he tried to build himself up. He tried to take control of the state. But more importantly, he reversed what was the first tangible piece of reparations Black people had ever got, which is 40 acres and a mule. And 40 acres and a mule came about not through something handed down from the top down. No, what happened was when General Sherman was marching to the sea, tearing through the South, liberating cities, he developed a train of liberated Africans who would follow him. And they became a strain on his contingent. And he said, well, what are we going to do with these people? So the federal government sent agents down to Sherman, and they met with the Black community, and they said, what can we do? And the Black community made it very clear, give us 40 acres and a mule. Dispossess the planting class on the Carolina coast, let us have their land and the means to work it. And this is actually something that was put into place and was successful until it was overturned. And it's significant that the overturning of 40 acres and a mule, the defeat of Reconstruction, happened when the military was pulled out the South. So we need to also then talk about the parallels with state violence between both Black people seeking protection and advancement and both fighting against states. So these movements that we see now in the streets are tied to one fact, which is that capitalism cannot achieve Black liberation. Capitalism cannot even give the basic gains of democracy, things like the right to vote, which we see being eradicated under Trump with the repeal of parts of the Voting Rights Act. So in this capitalist system, we see time and time again, rebellions and rebellions. The ghettos go up in flames and people say, oh, well, it's a riot. They're just burning down their own things. But if riots are the language of the unheard, what do you call it when during a so-called riot, people are making demands, economic demands for jobs. They're making demands for justice, and they're making demands to say, where is our piece of the pie? And I think it points to the question we should all be asking ourselves as members of the Democratic Socialists of America, which is, can this system as it exists bring about Black liberation? And if that's the case, how do we explain these continual rebellions, and what role do the rebellions then play, right, in getting us even the most small and tangible gains? The Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney in the 70s once commented that in the metropoles in the United States, in Britain and Canada and the other imperialist countries, they have a thing called democracy. So they have some leeway for people to engage in struggle before repressing them. Well, I think 40 years after Rodney's assassination, that needs to be updated a little, because the economic crisis that's been wrought upon global capitalism, first by the subprime mortgage crisis, and now by this COVID-19 crisis, even before we could fully recover from the Great Recession, shows that capitalism does not have concrete things to give Black people. Again, I'm not on the street. What they have to give is concretely symbolic gestures. They can kneel in Kentucky stove. They can put up Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's names on Link NYC public display systems in New York City, but they can't. They have nothing to give insofar as what they gave in the 60s and 70s when Watts and other places erupted. The last time they gave us a slew of public sector jobs. This time around, as a result of COVID-19, they will be cutting public sector jobs. So the tangible benefits are not there. And it really points to us having a critical investigation, interrogation of the system we live in and our class positionality within it. So I know Vanessa will touch on these subjects, and we're going to have a question and answer period, and I'll end.
Okay, Robert, we're gonna move on with the rest of the agenda, but thank you so much for your remarks. That was great. So I'd like to introduce Vanessa Wills now to talk a bit about COVID capitalism. Vanessa.
Okay, great. And I trust that everyone can hear me just fine. My name is Vanessa Wills. I'm assistant professor of philosophy at George Washington University. So I'm here in DC. And my work focuses, I'm a philosopher, and my work is in moral, social, and political philosophy and Marx and philosophy of race. And the crisis that one of the things that's sort of notable and interesting and important to unpack about the current moment is that obviously what we have is not just one crisis, but many all bundled together. So we have this crisis of racism and police brutality, especially against Black people. We have the crisis of COVID-19, and then we have just a fundamental crisis of capitalism that has been unfolding, well, for a very long time, but especially when we think about the contemporary period, we're talking about really the recession of 2008, and then the very uneven recovery, a recovery that has mainly benefited capital, while poor and working people just experience deeper cuts, right, to all kinds of social services and to their living standards. And so my topic here is COVID-19 and capitalism, and thinking about race and COVID-19 capitalism. And of course, that brings in a number of different threads as we think about the historical setting within which this is occurring. So, there's this explosion of activism that has emerged in recent weeks. And one question that comes up again and again is, well, why now, right? So we had the specific horror and occasion for disgust that was provided by this video of the brutal murder committed against George Floyd. And it's true that there are kind of specific facts about this death and this documentation that is outrageous, right? As a kind of specific a cultural object that we've seen, right? And so there's something about just the very nature of the act itself that causes outrage. But of course, it's also important to look at the threads, the elements, the social forces immediately preceding and leading up to that point. And it's just no accident when we think about how this particular moment is situated within the broader context of COVID-19 and how it's been dealt with or how it's not been dealt with. And so, over the past several months, we had, first of all, a lot of denialism, especially coming from our dear leader, Professor, President Trump, right? So we have this kind of denialism, break with reality, break with reason, break with science. Which we all saw led to foot dragging, impeding the process of preparing ourselves for this pandemic, which was foreseeable, right? Anyone who was watching, of course, what was going on in China, but also looking at the health crisis unfolding in Italy, was in a position, right, to see what was headed here. So we had that, and then once it was taken more seriously by our government here, especially by our federal government here, you still started to see that not only was there a lack of will on the part of people in positions of power, but also just a lack of fundamental capacity, right? And so we saw how our capacity, our material capacity, right, the presence of PPE, the presence of ventilators, of hospital beds, of hospitals at all, right, was just so diminished. We were just completely unequal to the task of addressing this health crisis. And so that's a different kind of analytic insight into how capitalism manifests here in the United States, right? Where it's not just a question of does the president, do governors, do CEOs have the will, right? Have the kind of subjective desire to do anything to save the lives of human beings. But even if they did, right, there's just this kind of irrationality and incapacity within the system itself. And so, that manifested in all sorts of ways. One of them is that in recent years, especially accelerated over the past decade, the closures of hospitals throughout the country. Hospitals in, it turns out that there's both a rash of hospital closures in cities and a rash of hospital closures in rural areas. Even the hospitals that were open, folks might know, right? One of the kind of obvious irrationalities of our system is that lots of medical professionals have actually lost their jobs during COVID-19, right? At a time when we need as great and robust a capacity as possible when it comes to medical workers being employed, being in a position to help. And the reason why is that as elective procedures were put on hold, that led to then layoffs, right, for all sorts of nurses, doctors, and other kinds of medical professionals. So there's just this kind of I'm just going to hammer this point, right? A real irrationality in the way that resources are allocated, and including human power, right? So you have that, and as I said, you have the lack of PPE, the outrageous photographs of medical workers in trash bags, medical workers dying of COVID-19, and so you have not only that, but then also throughout the economy, this very sudden bright light on the fact that the people who are most protected within this economy and most well remunerated for their efforts are not the people that we all rely upon in a time of crisis, right? The people who were keeping the country fed, who were continuing to operate public transit, who were working in various factory settings and so on, right? These folks that get the label of essential labor, but are not treated as though they're essential labor, are not treated as though they are precisely the people that we most depend on in a time of crisis, right? The only, really this barrier between, us and complete societal breakdown. Society has broken down a little bit, but it's not total bedlam, and it's because of the work that people are doing in all of these kinds of categories of essential labor. And so what that does, right, it both reveals the, just like the sort of fundamental silliness of allowing these important decisions about how society is organized to be made by people who don't have any subjective particular desire to keep us alive, and also seem to lack the organization and ability and facility with just reason and planning to do it. Right. And meanwhile, we see people who are on the front lines organizing and saying, we need PPE. We need to organize things differently so that we can have our needs met and keep people safe. So I'll just take one more minute, right, to kind of bring this home, right? So when we think about why have we seen this huge kind of swell of outrage around the murder of George Floyd? I think it has to be understood against the backdrop of how capitalism in the United States has responded to COVID-19 and what it has revealed about something deeply rotten, right, at the core. And then on top of that, you have the death of George Floyd together with a number of other well-publicized racist events that further, right, kind of drive this point home that something is deeply rotten at the core of our society and has to be fixed isn't even the right word, right? Has to be swept away and replaced with something else. So I can go on for a very long time about this. So, but I'll wrap up the point there. That I think when we think about the operations of race and class, and that is something that has been a contested theme in thinking about this moment. We have to think about the ways that we can, of course, isolate these things abstractly as objects of analysis, but in practice, they are, completely fundamentally intertwined, and there is no detangling them. The people in these essential labor jobs are disproportionately people of color. People dying from COVID-19 is disproportionately people of color. And when we look at, why is it that such, that when we talk about the reopening and we talk about the acceptance of deaths and how that has been put forward as just a necessary but unfortunate feature of how we're going to deal with COVID-19, how much of that is legitimized, right, and justified by racism and by the idea that the people who are most affected by COVID-19 are the people whose lives are considered not so valuable, right, in the social space within which we operate. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the fight back against COVID capitalism, against police killings, and how the Black experience under COVID and through these uprisings has contributed to the wider class struggle. So the next speaker is going to be Alicia Hernandez from St. Louis DSA.
Hey everyone, my name is Alicia Hernandez. I'm with St. Louis DSA and also our local AfroSoc Caucus. My gender pronouns are she, her. I'm also a legal observer coordinator, and I'm one of the organizers of the St. Louis ICE Rapid Response Line. It's a rapid response network for people to call in and get support whenever there is any sort of ICE activity or potential raid in our communities. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how non-Black Latinx people here in St. Louis, we've been building solidarity with the movement for Black lives and sort of addressing the anti-Blackness that has been popping up. So we don't have a local Black Lives Matter chapter. We've actually been attending the protests and following the lead of two groups, Expect Us and Action St. Louis. These are two groups that came together after the murder of Mike Brown during the Ferguson uprising in 2014. So our local chapter, we've had some folks joining street medics, doing legal observing, joining jail support groups. As far as the non-Black Latinx people in our groups and in our communities, we've been very intentional about addressing, confronting, redirecting the anti-Blackness that is popping up. That might be statements, reporting, different ways that Hispanic and non-Black Latinx activists are showing up. So actually having a group of people checking in with each other, who's talking to this person? Did you see that post? Did you talk to them? Did you see this report that came out? And having those agitational conversations. We're also really pushing that phrases like Latinx for Black Lives actually erases the fact that there are Black Latinx people. So we're really trying to push a lot of activists to get away from that phrasing and really kind of come to really reckoning with the fact that at least in St. Louis, we have erased Black Latinx and Black immigrant voices. A lot of our stories and narratives that we uplift here in St. Louis equate the immigrant experience to that of a brown Latinx experience. And so we're really trying to have folks sit down and talk about this and talk about what this looks like, and even kind of going past that and reimagining how we build power. So here in St. Louis, and I think in other places too, the immigrant rights movement has been historically led by white people. We've been building power, with white people. We've been convincing white people that we contribute this much in taxes, that we're good. We want white people to feel sorry for us because they're the ones who ultimately make these decisions. And although that's true, we're not building power with our closest allies, who are Black people and other people of color who understand that this struggle goes beyond having documents, having papers. So we've been having closed conversations with some leaders in the community. We've also been planning more open conversations for people to come and talk about it, having white, brown, and Black Latinx people lead some of these conversations, and very intentionally addressing that we've noticed a lot of Latinx people see white supremacy as an issue that is specific to the US. So really historically going through how white supremacy is also rooted in, some Latin American countries. How does it show up there? Let's talk about that to start to break down these barriers that people seem to have. Yeah, and so I mentioned earlier that there is also the St. Louis Ice Rapid Response Line. That is something that STLDSA is in coalition with. And so we are having conversations with the people that are in our networks, people in our community, having some virtual conversations, connecting very explicitly the demand to defund and abolish the police to ICE. Having conversations about how police responsible for killing Black people, immigrant and non-immigrant, are the same forces that collaborate with ICE to separate families. We're also creating and compiling different resources and flyers in multiple languages, so we can start handing that out and giving that out to folks. We're also very intentionally pushing the demands from our local groups Expect Us and Action St. Louis. They have 5 demands. They are defund the police, disarm, decommission, dismiss the police, finally and fully close the workhouse. So if you don't know, there's essentially a debtor's prison in St. Louis. It locks up mostly Black people who haven't been found guilty of a crime because they can't pay bail. And there has been an ongoing campaign to close the workhouse, and that's been led by Action St. Louis. And they're really close to getting it closed. So we're doing whatever we can to push that messaging, especially connecting it with our folks who are in the ICE Rapid Response Line. The 4th is free all political prisoners, and 5 is make reparations. So we've been pushing those, following those demands. And I mean, that's what we're following. We're following the leadership of Expect Us and Action St. Louis, as well as kind of trying to move our folks, our non-Black Latinx folks in St. Louis. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Just one question before we move on. In the chat, Sean is asking, is there a website or other platform up for the demands that y'all or your partners are making?
Oh, absolutely. I'll pull that up. I'll drop that in the chat in a bit.
Thanks so much. Okay, we're moving on to our last speaker before we get into question and answer. Our next speaker is going to be Datrion Wilkins from New Orleans.
Hi, everyone. My name is Datrion Wilkin, and I am a representative / spokesperson for the City Waste Union that is based in New Orleans. I do not live in New Orleans. I live in Houston, Texas, but I am kind of the command center and kind of the heart of the it comes to outreach and having conversations like this conversation, because a lot of the guys are normally on the strike line, and or by the time they get off the strike line, they're so tired they don't want to talk anymore. So just to kind of give a bit of a background on what we're doing and who we are, the City Waste Union is a group of what was 26 men and is now 15 men who went on strike about May 4th or May 5th. And they were asking for the 4 general things that they've always been asking for, but they just decided to go on strike. The guys are asking for $150 per week of hazard pay. They're asking for proper distribution and or any distribution of PPE, so personal protective equipment. They're asking for better working conditions because they ride on the sides of trucks that are in constant disrepair. And they're asking for a higher living wage of $15 per hour, as they currently make $10.25 per hour. So the guys are in somewhat of a battle, a public battle with the company that they were employed with. What this company has done, it's called Metro Disposal Services, is they force the hoppers, that's what the guys are called, the sanitation workers are also called hoppers. They force them into a situation where they've been made to be subcontract employees, where they are never going to be actual employees of Metro. They have, a lot of these guys have worked for Metro for 10 years plus. So just imagine working for a company and never being offered a raise, or never being offered healthcare, or never being offered a day off sick. So how does this all tie into our general theme of Juneteenth, and how are we going to make reparation for these 15 men? What we're asking for at this point, tomorrow we do have a rally that's going to be in the city of New Orleans, and the guys will be going on a march, so they will be going there. And they're going to be asking a public ask, they're going to be asking that people support and come out and show just a general gathering of support for these guys for the things that they're asking for, because they're not asking for much. And to speak to a lot of the points that were also discussed here on the call, you know, the people who are treated as priorities in this country are the people who have the smallest footprints on the roads that we travel. People like us, people like you and I, who are organizers, or people who live in communities where people are constantly affected by policing and being taken advantage of by being made to be constituents of city council members and or people who are representing them in the state. And these representatives have no interest in changing things, or even being agents of change where there's not this constant cycle of poverty. How can a grown man with children take care of his child making $10.25 per hour? But that same man works 70-hour work weeks and still not be able to make ends meet. We did publish a video. It is available on our Facebook page. The Facebook page is the City Waste Union. So the guys get to tell a little bit more of their story to make clear what they're experiencing and what they're going through. This company that they work for is a locally African-American owned company. And I think when we talk about Black business, we want to celebrate Black business and we want to celebrate Black people. And that's always the best thing. But I think what is important to remember and is less talked about is something that one of my friends said: all skin folk ain't kin folk. And we need to be clear about the lines that are drawn when people are in positions of power and can be agents of change, and they make decisions just not to be. We need to be clear about what happens or what we do as a community when we watch the police smother a man live and in color, when we see it happen and people can't speak up and we can't make these things change. So it is so important that us as the constituents in the communities who hire, or because that's what we do, we hire them, or who elect these officials, that we make them officials that stand for the things that we stand for. You know, a lot of times when we think about race and class, we do separate those things. But for us, this company is Black. So how do we separate the classism and then also separate the race there? Because we can't say it's a race issue. But what happens a lot of times in our society that myself and the guys have recognized is that there's a division within our race of people who are Black who feel like this, and then people who are Black who are here. How do we bridge that gap? How do we change the capitalism? How do we change the classism? And how do we make a company that has a $10.7 million contract with the city? How do we get them to the table for us to have this open discussion and ask why they can't pay more than $10.25? Or why a grown man who's worked for this company for over 20 years will never receive a raise because he works as a subcontract employee? Or why he'll never get benefits? Why he'll never have vacation? So these are things that we're trying to change in the city of New Orleans, and we're trying to be the agents of those changes. It's been difficult. We've been on strike for 6 weeks. In that time frame, we've raised over $135,000. We're continuing to ask for support because that money goes to the guys, you know, to help take care of their families. It's acting as a strike fund. We're also selling t-shirts and doing things like that in the city. So I'll post and show you guys what the t-shirts look like so we can make them available to you if you'd like to purchase one. But more than anything, what we're trying to do is we're trying to change the way that Black bodies are being exploited in this country. We're trying to break the chains of bondage that used to be the slave masters, but in some way is still being the slave master, but it just so happens that this master is Black and is a Black-owned company in the city of New Orleans. So we are trying to change those things, and we're trying to change the juxtaposition of this is what happened back in 1865 when these people, when people didn't even know they were free, and now they had to find out. But it feels like we're not free either. It feels like these men are being held by these chains of bondage created by a company that just seems to continually invest in this system of constant poverty for these men. And not just for these men, but there are several different industries in New Orleans that do these things, like the hospitality industry, the baristas who are on strike. These guys, these people who make this city thrive and make the city what it is, they are treated the worst, while we watch the people who profit get treated like kings and queens, and they literally have no footprint on the road that people like you and I travel. So we're definitely trying to be agents of change. And thank you guys for giving us the opportunity to even discuss here. I'm not an organizer, I just kind of became this. So we do definitely appreciate this space and allowing us to have this dialogue.
Thank you so much, Datrion. So this point in the agenda now, we're moving into question and answer. So I encourage folks to use the Q&A feature within Zoom, the little button at the bottom bar, or ask them in the chat. Either one works, I'll be watching both. I'm gonna keep time for each question. So we wanna try and get, quick questions and keep the responses, relatively short if possible. I know that's not always possible. But before I get into that, I just want to do a couple things. I just want to kind of acknowledge for a moment all the people that have been murdered by the cops, by the police recently. I want to recognize Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Jamel Floyd, David McAtee, and Rayshard Brooks. And one more thing before we get into our question and answer portion of the panel. Just wanted to let folks know about AfroSocialists. And I said at the top, AfroSocialists is building power with DSA's Black and Socialists of Color membership in their communities to build the multiracial working class base that we need to build socialism, because there's no other way. I'm going to drop the link for AfroSoc in the chat if you want to find out more about AfroSocialist Caucus. And then I'm going to move into question and answer. So we already have a few queued up. I'm gonna share the first. So Adrian was wondering if any of y'all would care to talk about class reduction, this seeming ignorance of the very real perpetuation of white supremacy, inequitable wealth, and labor vis-a-vis whiteness dominated socialist spaces. Is class reductionism not ignoring those very real material conditions? Sorry, it's a mouthful, they say, but wanted to know what y'all thought about that. So this one's open to whoever wants to get into it.
I'll speak to it.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not. I'll have to be forgiven if I'm not sure I follow all the contours of the question, but I'm happy to sort of speak, about this problem of class reductionism. So first of all, what do we mean by class reductionism? And I generally think that, what we have in mind, or when that accusation is made against Marxists, for example, right, the thought is that somehow we can describe the harms that are done to Black people without ever actually referencing their Blackness, right? Or without ever actually invoking the fact of race as one of the explanatory factors in that description. So if we look, for example, at the fact that people of color have been disproportionately bearing the burden of COVID-19, maybe a kind of class reduction analysis would say, right, maybe, we can explain all of that without ever mentioning their race and just pointing out some things about how, for example, people who are poor, right, or people who lack generational wealth of certain kinds, or people who live in underserved neighborhoods are disproportionately harmed by COVID-19. And then the idea would be, we don't actually have to say anything about their race in order to understand what's going on. There might even be like some kind of static sense in which that's true, that we can give some kind of like snapshot picture of what's happening. And in that kind of fixity, right, say like, oh, okay, well, look at this, right? The people who disproportionately are harmed, they just have lower incomes, right? But if we want to understand these things in a dynamic, processual, historical manner, we're going to want to know all kinds of things about, is it really just a kind of accident that the people who are disproportionately in these lower economic circumstances also tend to be people of color, also tend to be the people who are marked out by this social category of Blackness, right? But it's also true for people who are Latino. It's also true for people who are for Native people. When we talk about this, the Native people are the one group that is more disproportionately the target of police brutality, right, than Blacks. And if you want to actually give an explanation, not just a kind of static snapshot description of one isolated moment held in, kind of like Polaroid fixity. If you really want to understand, right, how is it that we came here and how are we going to intervene into this social circumstance in order to change it, it's going to be very difficult to do, and indeed impossible, right, without invoking the category of race. Now, that's not to say that when we talk about race, which in large part it does operate as a kind of ideological structure, a superstructural structure, it does operate in that space. That doesn't mean that it is unreal, less real, not efficacious, doesn't have important causal import. It doesn't mean any of that. That's not, I'm a Marxist, that's not Marx's analysis of how to understand the relationship between ideas and matter. And more importantly than the kind of exegetical point, it's just not going to get us there to understanding, the relationship between the way that we organize our social world and how that interacts, right, with these economic facts. So there's all sorts of things that, a kind of class reductionist stance is going to get wrong. And in general, I just think it's, it's going to be necessarily ahistorical. And because it's ahistorical, it's not going to tell us enough about how we got here and how we get out of it.
Well said, Vanessa. Anybody else have any comment on that specific question?
Justin, if I can jump in.
Sure.
Yeah, and sorry to be losing my voice so that I was at a protest earlier. So just to piggyback a little on what Vanessa was saying, right? Vanessa is positing what I would call different poles within the left, within the working class, and even within the DSA, you could say that there's a pole on one side called identity politics and a pole on the other side called class reductionism. And the reality is no one positively identifies with either term. No one goes around saying, I'm an identity politics person. No one goes around saying, I'm a class reductionist. These are labels, right, that we're applying to other people to describe their politics. So what is it that people are trying to describe? What they're trying to describe is the age-old question on the left of, is it race or is it class that's the driving and motive factor of history? And against that dichotomy, I would push back with Walter Rodney's perspective that it is neither race nor class, neither an airy combination of the two, but rather how race and class interact in concrete historical circumstances. For example, the way race and class interact in Brazil, right, would not be the same way it interacts in the United States. The way race and class interacts in the United States in 2020 is not the same thing of understanding race and class in 19th century USA. So you have to dig down deep into the actual material analysis of the situation, and that's what people don't want to do. So someone says, give an example. Well, one example is this guy who floats around part of the DSA called Adolph Reed, a very respected Black professor who, like Vanessa pointed out, does not really like to talk much about race. If you want to see something that approximates Adolph Reed's position, for example, I would say go read the World Socialist website. The World Socialist website has tons of articles about George Floyd. None of them really mentions that he was Black or that race was a factor in his killing. But for example, if you read Adolph Reed's latest article that tries to downplay the racially disproportionate impact of COVID-19, he does not cite one statistic in that article, right? Someone is saying we're not going to slander Adolph Reed. Adolph Reed is not going to slander our movement and get away with it. Let's be clear about that. We have people dying. It's totally serious. And if you're this proposed Marxist, what you have to do is dig down into the concrete material history. And if you don't want to do that, but you make wild claims and accusations, and what you're putting forward is not Marxism, it's not socialism, it's a naked empiricism that tries to deny the reality of not just racism under capitalism, but race. And I'll end with this. So people will tell us that sociologically race is a social construct. And who can disagree with it from a historical perspective, right? Like where before the Europeans came to the quote unquote New World, was race a distinct and defining factor in people's lives? Nowhere. So it was a social construct that was meant to justify slavery. But we cannot ignore the extent to which it is also a social fact of life and is reflected in the lived realities of people, the daily experiences, right? And this is why the movement we're in is happening. We are all George Floyd because any moment that myself, Justin, Vanessa, or anyone else on this call steps outside, we don't feel safe when we see the police. We have to worry about our well-beings. And it's not just because we're part of the working class, which we are. It's a large part because of the color of our skin. And our society has used this anti-Black racism to both divide the working class and intensify the exploitation of the wider working class. And we have to find ways to fight it, but you can't fight it if you don't acknowledge it. And that to me is what class reductionism is. It's refusing to understand the working class as a heterogeneous body in which one of the divisions comes from the fact that Black people are excluded from various parts of working class life, both in jobs, in housing, and even in social programs.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. I'm going to move to a specific question for Juliana, or kind of like I'm going to combine two questions for Juliana. The question is from Nikhil. What do you think about the capacity of leftist organizations in the US and Brazil to address this crisis? How should they work within what seems to be an unplanned social movement in a way that doesn't disrupt or co-opt them while preventing liberals or bad elements from doing the same? And also, how can the US, how can leftist activist organizers in the US and Brazil collaborate at a time like this?
Thank you. So I'm going to start saying that the actions in Brazil are not unplanned, quite differently. I know that like a lot of the protests that are going in the US right now, they are related somehow like to a framing, right? There's a lot of people who are not organizing, going to the streets, but the protest, oh, my sound's not working.
We can hear you, it's just a little low. Maybe just speak a little bit more directly into your mic.
Okay, I'm gonna try to raise my voice to see if you all can hear me better. Can you hear me better? Okay, so, and I'm also trying to just run the thing on my computer to fix that. So as I was saying, the protests in Brazil, they're not, no, the mic is not covered by something. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not working well. The protests in Brazil, they are planned. What is going on in Brazil is result of a long time of grassroots, but also organization work. So a quote, for example, I mentioned, for example, the Black Coalition for Rights, that is this alliance among more than 100 Black organizations. So the strategy to create a national front, a national Black front against capitalism, against racism, against patriarchy, it's planned. It comes from a long time of debates and a between political organizations. And so what did this put us in the situation? How to address the current crisis, right? That is to understand that the things in Brazil are planned. I think that we need to differentiate between the white left and the Black left. Sounds a little louder now. Okay, I hope you guys can hear me. I'm sorry for that. Why I'm saying the Black left and the white left? As in the United States, in Brazil, and in other countries of Latin America and Caribbean, we always had a white group saying that race was something subordinated to class. In fact, that has been the history of many of the Marxist groups in Brazil since the 60s. And I agree with what Vanessa and Orbit said. It's a denial of dialectics, it's a denial of history, this kind of vision. But it's this vision of what you're calling in Brazil the white left. It's also a way to try to create, in Brazil particularly, is a way to create political power, political privilege, let's say like that, based on Black death. And I have to explain a little bit why I'm saying that. In Brazil, how racism works in Brazil is that historically, being racist in Brazil is kind of ugly. Nobody wants to assume to be racist. You know, everybody wants to be politically correct in that sense. And race has always been discussed since the foundation of the country. Brazil was the larger slavery system in the Americas and the longest slavery system from that time. So the foundation of the country was based on the debate on race, but they also had this thing, how the elites created the country was saying, oh, we are cool. We kind of don't have segregation. We kill Black people on the streets, but we don't have apartheid system officially like a Jim Crow, so we are anti-racist, while the United States is racist. So they used this discourse of aligned to the anti-racist struggle in the foundation of my country to actually keep the killing of Black people. And why I'm saying all that? Because right now, in the particular moment that we are, how the Black left organizations have responded to the crisis, it literally, it's not separating themselves from the other movements, but is pressuring all the movements to recognize that there is no capitalism without racism and no racism without capitalism. That cannot, that if you deny the importance of race, you're actually breaking with your only tie to the true revolution, to attack to capitalism in its totality. And to give a concrete examples, before the coup in 2016, that we had a coup d'etat in 2016 in Brazil, the government had spent almost more than 10 years in a leftist government, right? And in this leftist government that was defending many issues that are extremely important, like the inequality, like the reduction of the financial inequality, we had an increase, extremely increase of violence against Black people. Nowadays in Brazil, 75% of people who die are Black. 75%, and I'm talking about one of the 10 most violent countries in the world. So how you can have more than 10 years of a government that claims for economic equality, that was partnered with many movements, but we still have something like, I'm talking about the Workers' Party government for who knows a little bit more about the Brazil, but who at the same time has an increasing in incarceration, an increasing in police violence, and an increasing promotion of the murder of Black people. So what that actually means, and we're talking a lot about in the Black organizations nowadays, that people are scared, the white left is scared about the coup d'etat that happened in 2016, but these authoritarian structures that are in the power right now, they're the same authoritarian structures that kept violence in the Black communities. So exactly because there was never a really addressing of anti-Blackness in Brazil, we have the current president, Bolsonaro. He's very connected with the militias in Rio de Janeiro. The militias are kind of paramilitary groups that historically have attacked favelas in Rio de Janeiro. So it's not that you have, we had democracy before and now we are having authoritarian state. Is that you have the authoritarian states that before only attacked Black people, gain power in a such way that now it's becoming the whole state and attacking everybody. And so that is a little bit of how I can answer the question about how the leftist organizations and what they can do. And just to talk about the possibilities of partnerships. Black transnationalism, internationalism comes, for what I know, since Haiti Revolution, right? We have a long history and a long path of dialogue, although imperialism and capitalism, and they also try to make divisions about us, we all have a strong history of solidarity. So I'm just going to give one example for you. People are carrying in Brazil the name of George Floyd because also there's a recognition that you only can reach out a true liberation if you work together globally. Also oppressed people around the world globally. But to reach out to increase and strengthen solidarity, we do have to fight with how the news are posted and how people read some realities. When I give concrete examples, I said before that the myth that the anti-Blackness is a problem of the United States, it was part of the foundation of anti-Blackness in Brazil, but also in many other countries in Latin America and Caribbean. And these kinds of myths, what is happening right now, it's happening only in the United States. It's a denial of how other Black lives, non-American lives, are being killed. And this is intentionally reproduced by the media in an attempt to try to invisibilize struggles that are going on in other places. So I read, for example, about the protests that are happening in London, that are happening in France, that are happening in Uruguay. And I know for contact with these movements that many of them, they have local shoes. So they're also claiming against anti-Blackness in their countries and in solidarity with the US. But the news report just the solidarity part to invisibilize the local issues, right? So I think that one way to strengthen solidarity is to break with this one narrative of what is anti-Blackness and this idea that this is happening only in the US, to try to understand the struggle as a more global thing. And everybody, anti-Blackness is global, but also have a global struggle against. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. We're about at the end of our time, so I wanted to kind of get one more question. I'm sorry to everybody that asked questions in the Q&A, but we were a little bit limited on time. But I want to get one question that can kind of be posed to all of our panelists, and people can, if they feel inspired to, they can try and answer. This question was posed specifically to Datrion, but I want to ask everybody, is how would you describe the relationship that white supremacy and the enslavement of Black and brown bodies have with capitalism? And I want to add to that, what role do you see for the Democratic Socialists of America, for the socialist left in this country, in actualizing the Black liberation that I talked about at the beginning of the event that Robert touched on? What is it that we can do in this moment and beyond to I guess to make this country live out what it says it is?
Can I take that one?
Please.
Jessica here. Be honest, I think we have to I think that's actually a notion we need to challenge, that we can make this country what it needs to be. This country has never been for Black lives. It's been built in the interest of the white ruling class since its inception. And I think beliefs that we can reform this system away, or even make having militant reforms that will address the problems that we have, is it's faulty. I think we need to really talk about doing away with this, with what we call the United States of America, doing away with the system in its totality. And I mean, I think this might be something that makes me differ from other people who are in DSA, but I don't think we're going to be able to do that without a militant struggle to end capitalism. And that's why when I was speaking, I talked so much about militancy and the need to understand the proper place it has in resistance, because if we don't, we're not going to get to where we need to be. So I say this country is never going to live up to the ideas that it was, what people say this country was founded on. And we have to create something different. So yeah. I don't agree with that. Militancy isn't martyrdom. I don't see militancy as martyrdom. I'm not saying that we should be purposely getting caught by the police or purposely getting hurt, but it's a part of every single struggle. Every liberation struggle has its elements of militancy, and
sorry, Jessica, but can you clarify, how are you defining the word militancy in this case?
Okay. You know, it can include violence. It can include property destruction, but it's not limited to those things. I think there's even parts of the left a resistance to even nonviolent militancy, which is really just being assertive and standing your ground. But it does include all of those things. And when I was, you know, during the uprising, we saw all of those things happen to some extent. Particularly more on the property destruction side, which I frankly don't see as violence. People may differ in that opinion, but we saw that. And again, without that level of militancy, I don't think we'd be having police abolition as a national talking point, something that's been put on the table. And yeah, I don't think we'd be talking I don't think the death of George Floyd would have sparked yes, I agree, self-defense by any means necessary, exactly. I don't think we would see the world being as inspired as they have been to take action in defense of Black lives if not for the militancy of the people in the streets. It inspired people. Militancy does inspire people because it's a show of power and people respect power.
Thanks, Jessica. So, Datrion, would you like to respond? Because the question was posed directly to you, and I wanted to get everybody's word. But you specifically, how would you, describe the relationship between white supremacy and enslavement of Black and brown people and capitalism?
So I agree with Jessica in the sense that militancy is necessary, but I also think that abolition is the answer. But abolition with the means to create something different, because I don't think that abolition is just, okay, let's just abolish the police. What is the answer? What will happen once the abolishing comes into play? I think that militancy has also been made martyrdom by the sacrificing of Black bodies. So there has been there have been situations where we have been militant as Black people, but we've been struck down for being militant. When in the same sense, you've seen in the country all over people walking around with tiki torches and wearing white sheets, and they're being militant as well. So they are not being sacrificed. This has never been a land of united states. It's never happened. This has never been the land of the free, because I don't know that, or if it has been the land of the free, it's just been on our backs. It's never been that we've actually been free here. So what has happened for us as a society is we have been forced into this perpetual cycle of policing. We've been made the criminals here. We've been made the animals. We've been made the people who are supposed to be who everyone's supposed to be against, when in truth we're the people who built this shit. Like, we made this shit be what it is. We are the builders of the White House. We are the builders of this country. We created things. And so when people ask the question and say, what can we do? What do we do? As Black people, we do continue to be militant, but we also stop with the belief that, right, there is no easy way to this. It's not easy. People will be sacrificed. There will be times when people, and it will happen. It is inevitable. But we have to disrupt this system. There's no other option. Disruption has to occur. And if that means we have to be militant in the streets, and that means that we're forced to be the martyrs, unfortunately, that's where we are in this. That's just who we are right here and right now. And we have to stop with the belief or with trying to find the right way to prance and priss around how other people view this. Fuck them. That's my honest assessment of this. Let's stop caring about what people will say because we're the Black people raising the fist and causing the disruptions, because there is nothing that happens in life without a little bit of disruption, or a whole lot of disruption. No growth occurs in your life without disruption. So I'm all for for being militant. I'm all for disrupting the process or disrupting the progress of a cycle that continues to perpetuate our downfall. So that my thought process to this is fuck what they think. It's our time, and it's time that we take back the country that we built. And not just us, but these indigenous people who have been here way longer than we have, the people who were stolen from all those years ago when America became America. We need to have these people, we need to be able to speak to that power that we all hold. And we have so much, and I pose this question to every person I meet: what does your influence buy you? Will it buy you the opportunity to sit at the table and have the conversations that Black people who are in power are scared to have because they've been compromised, and they have taken this chance to say, oh, I really, really want to sit at the table with the important people. And then once they get there, they're scared to talk because they take the stands like OJ, I'm not Black, I'm OJ. They take those stances. How do we continue, as people who are a part of the fight, we got to be able to say, fuck y'all, it's time for us to rise. That's what's important.
Does anybody have any further response about the relationship between white supremacy, enslavement of Black and brown folks, and capitalism, and how we actually, if it's possible to make this country be what it says it is, how we do that?
I'm happy to speak to it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's so peculiar about the United States is that, of course, I think, lots of people who are listening to this right now probably know this, but in general, it's not widely known that, for example, slavery was never actually abolished, right, or made unconstitutional. The Constitution says that slavery is permissible in one instance, and that is as punishment for a crime. And so you put that together with the period immediately following Reconstruction, right, in this country, the kind of backlash that had the name redemption, the redemption of Southern aristocracy, right, is what it was. So you have slavery as punishment, as an appropriate, quote unquote, punishment for a crime. And then you look at what counts as crimes, and crimes include things like not being employed by a white person, right? Could get you arrested, put in jail, and we still have places like Angola Prison in Louisiana, which it just is actually a former slave plantation, and seamlessly made the transition from slave plantation to place where people were taken when they were enslaved as punishment for quote unquote crimes. And, that's one very acute example, but it is something that encapsulates how much the current prison system that we have in this country is a very direct, it's not even subtle, a very direct descendant of slavery, right? Or reformulation of slavery. This is one of the reasons why reform demands are not going to cut it, because capitalism, American capitalism has proven quite well that it is happy to reform, reconstitute, rethink, reimagine, remix, this system as many times as it's going to take for us to have to push that boulder up the hill again and fight the fight over again. This is the observation that pushes us to radical politics, where we realize that the problem is about who has the power to do the reforming, right? And to whose ends is the system reformed? This question of slavery and the way that, that slavery is a great example of a reformed institution that persists with us today, that we can't tolerate, right, one moment longer. So, there's lots of things to say about this, but I think one of the things that it does is just highlight the kind of bankruptcy of strictly reformist solutions to the problems that face us.
Juliana, you had something that you wanted to add.
I just wanted to give a very quickly and short
contribution from Global South in the sense of the relationship between slavery and capitalism. Like, I know that this is not a very common idea in the United States, so like I don't ask that everybody agree, but just some food for thought. Many third world Marxism, and it's especially Latin America, have talked also about how there is how the class reductionism, or the view of, you know, that economics is something that's connected from slavery. It's also related to a very reduced view of capitalism. So that work usually defines capitalism solely as a mode of production based on wage. So they only can see certain kinds of exploitations that comes especially from working relationships. But there is a very historical debate in other places showing, for example, that slavery was not only a process of accumulation, primitive accumulation to capitalism, but also was producing the capitalist logics per se. So some people are going to talk and suggest to think capitalism as actually an economic logic of production that is oriented toward profit. And why does this make a difference? Nowadays, we cannot understand the violence in Global South that produce economic profit without you understand that we still have contemporary slavery, not only in prisons, but only the beginning of this year, we had in Brazil like three farms that were people that were caught with enslaved labor, right? And they're not people that are in prison; they're just people being enslaved. So the economics of that are produced, for example, by the drug cartels and by the rape of Black women in Latin America, but also in other places. So there are many logics of exploitation of people. Some people have talked about accumulation by sedation that are not only connected to age. So just to conclude, what I'm just giving a food for thought for people who are interested to know a little bit like about this line of thought is that if you think capitalism as this logic of for profit, as this tireless search for profit in a global market, you can understand that many of modes of production that are not necessarily based on wage, but in a super exploitation of people in Global South, they're also part of capitalism system. And they also feed capitalist system. And you also can understand a few ideas about how race operates, right? And central to capitalism, because what is the ground line of the creation of modern capitalism, right? Is the idea that a body, it's not necessarily the idea that we want surplus value, but the idea that a body, a human body, can be per se a merchandise. And that was what slavery brought as a logic of production, but also a cultural logic to the world. It's literally that there are some people that are not more people, they're reduced to their own idea of object, of for profit and merchandise. And these kinds of logic, they're still spread out in many countries. And yeah, somebody talked, for example, about human traffic. That's for sure. I've worked with sex workers in Brazil, and you have a lot of problems with human traffic, for example. So many people are talking from the movements that I work with changing that. So if we understand capitalism like that and how race sustains capitalism logics of production, not necessarily one particular mode, we also can think in terms of economics of life. That is a production of a new way to see economics and forms of being and living that focus on preserving of people's life and not the reduction to people bodies to merchandise. So it's just a short contribution. I hope, I don't know, maybe somebody is interested or somebody knows this and wants to dilate. Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you, Juliana. Anybody else on the panel want to get in a word before we wrap up?
Yes, I did see a comment in the chat.